Today we're going to discuss the Spanish conquest of Mexico in between 1519 and 1521. This is probably the single most famous campaign by Europeans against the non-Western adversary during this period. And so we're going to look at it in some detail, as does Victor Davis Hanson in Carnage and Culture. Behind me is the Cholula Pyramid, ruins near Puebla, Mexico. It is the largest archaeological site of a pyramid in the New World, as well as the largest pyramid by volume known to exist in the world today. It is absolutely huge. It is 180 feet tall and measures 1,480 feet by 1,480 feet. So each side nearly the length of nearly 5 football fields. So the idea that the things of this scale can only be found in the old world, in Eurasia, specifically in Egypt, is just not true. The indigenous peoples of North and South America were capable of tremendous feats of architecture and technology on their own. The Cholula Pyramid has traditionally been viewed as having been dedicated to the god Quetzalcoatl, who figures reasonably prominently in this presentation. Quetzalcoatl was a deity worshipped throughout Mesoamerica. The pyramid was similar to, though larger than, the Templo Mayor in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, where the Aztecs conducted human sacrifice, and which the Spanish conquistadors destroyed when they captured the city in 1521, replacing it eventually with a very large cathedral, which continues to exist to this day. Hernan Cortez occupied Cholula in 1519, and having heard rumors that the local leadership intended to rise up against him, preempted any such attempt by seizing and executing about 3,000 city residents, one of many examples of the ruthlessness with which the Spanish conducted the conquest of Central America. Let me put the screen up now and share with you the terms and learning objectives and so forth for today. Okay. Here are the terms. I'll give you a moment to either write them down really fast or take a screenshot with your smartphone, the recommended way to do it. By the end of this presentation, you should understand first the basics of the Aztec Empire, and secondly, the basics of Hernan Cortez's expedition into Mexico, the various explanations for Spanish success in defeating the Aztecs, and then finally, rationalism as an element in Hanson's Western way of war. In his chapter on the Spanish conquest of Mexico, he emphasizes this Western quality of rationalism as one of the 9 elements in this in what he sees as being a sort of a continuous Western way of war going back to the ancient Greeks. From 1492 through the early 1500s, Spanish voyages under first Christopher Columbus and then his successors reached the Bahamas and the Caribbean, colonizing Hispaniola and Cuba. In 1519, an unauthorized expedition under Hernan Cortez crossed the strait separating Cuba from Mexico, marched along the coast, and eventually turned inland toward the Aztec Empire. In February 1519, Cortez sailed to the Yucatan Peninsula in about 11 ships, carrying some 500 men, 13 horses, and a small number of cannon. Once ashore, he encountered a Franciscan priest who had been captured by the Mayans and had learned their language. Subsequently, Cortez received 20 women as slaves following a victory over the Tabasco. One of them, Malinali, also known as Doña Marina or La Minche, would become Cortez's mistress and served as his interpreter. La Malinche was indispensable in Cortez's extensive diplomatic dealings and in giving him a good feel for the local culture and power structure. Although Victor Davis Hanson, rejects her as being an important reason for Cortez's eventual success. By the autumn of 1519, Cortez had secured the support of Tlaxcala, and 1,000 of its warriors accompanied him as he marched upon Tenochtitlan. The Aztec Empire was relatively new and operated on the basis of a set of core states and a much wider network of tributary states, many of whom resented Aztec hegemony. So it's not as though the Spanish showed up and the Native Americans are like, oh my God, these are the enemy, we need to go after them. No, the idea was we have enemies at home. These Spanish might be useful to us in terms of taking out the bad guys that we've been dealing with for years, particularly the Aztecs. And so Cortez, once he cracked the code on this situation, was able to take advantage of it. The heart of the Aztec Empire was Tenochtitlan, the site of present-day Mexico City. The lakes surrounding Tenochtitlan have long since been drained. Its population is estimated at having been about 200,000, about the same size as the two largest cities in Europe, Paris and Naples at that time. In contrast, the population of Madrid in 1530 is estimated at having been no more than 5,500, that of Seville about 50,000, that of London also about 50,000. The Aztecs engaged in extensive human sacrifice, a common practice in Mesoamerica. A good estimate of how many people were sacrificed is about 20,000 people each year. These sacrifices came in large measure from flower wars, ritualized contests between the Aztecs and neighboring states. Each Aztec warrior was to secure one person for sacrifice. The flower wars were fought exclusively with the macahuitl, an obsidian-edged wooden club that could be used like a sword. This was to emphasize combat prowess. In regular political wars, not flower wars that had ritualized qualities, but just regular wars, a fight to the finish, the Aztecs made use of both the macahuitl and the atlatl, a throwing stick that was utilized by other cultures as well, such as the Inuit and the Australian Bushmen. The Aztecs would use both weapons against Cortez and his men. Cortez and his troops entered Tenochtitlan on November 8th, 1519. The Aztec monarch Montezuma II, often pronounced Moctezuma, greeted him at one of the causeways leading into the city. Moctezuma initially believed that Cortez was a representative of the deity Quetzalcoatl, in part because of the imposing sight of Cortez's heavy cavalry. The Aztecs had never seen horses, and by the Spanish possession of gunpowder weapons, whose noise and explosive force were both impressive and mysterious. Moctezuma voluntarily let Cortez into Tenochtitlan, apparently on the theory that he would study the Spaniards for weakness and destroy them later if necessary. Instead, his gifts of gold whetted the Spaniards' appetite for more. But tensions soon erupted between the Spaniards and the Aztecs, provoked in part by demands by Cortez that the Aztecs renounce their native beliefs and accept Christianity. Eventually, Cortez took Moctezuma prisoner as a means to control the Aztec population. But Cortez discovered that an expedition from Cuba had been sent to capture him. Bear in mind that his foray into the interior of Mexico was unauthorized by the Spanish governor in Cuba. So Cortez left 200 men in Tenochtitlan and then headed for the coast with the remainder to confront this expedition. The leader of the 200 men left behind in Tenochtitlan soon botched the delicate relationship between the Spanish and the local nobles. On the night of June 30th, 1520, the Aztecs attacked. The Spanish had to fight their way out of Tenochtitlan. La Noche Trista, as it's called, the night of sadness or the night of sorrows, which is June 30th through July 1st, 1520, forms Victor Davis Hanson's narrative introduction to the chapter on the Spanish conquest of Mexico. The Spanish suffered heavy losses, but were able to rejoin Cortez, who clamped a siege on Tenochtitlan by using brigantines. These are small warships built from local materials to control the lakes. In August 1521, after an extended siege, the Aztecs surrendered, and Cortez personally ruled Mexico until 1524. The key question in the Hanson chapter, and the only aspect of the Spanish conquest I want you to know in detail, is how did the Spanish succeed in conquering an empire many, many times their size? Hanson's answer is unorthodox. How did the Spanish win with so few men against the Aztec Empire? The best historian of the Aztec conquest, a fellow named Ross Hassig, not, be it recalled, Victor Davis Hanson, but Ross Hassig, who's an expert on this stuff. Ross Hassig lays stress on the Native American allies, perhaps as many as 100,000, who detested the Aztecs and who Cortez was therefore able to recruit to his cause. But Victor Davis Hanson maintains that this is not an adequate explanation, notwithstanding the fact that without their assistance, Cortez definitely could not have conquered the Aztecs. Hanson argues that if the Native American allies had been sufficient, they themselves could have destroyed the Aztecs without Spanish leadership and subsequently defeated Spanish attempts to subjugate all of Mexico. Hanson maintains that the allies joined Cortez because they were impressed enough by Spanish military might that they were convinced Cortez could do what they could not, destroy the Aztecs. And from a cultural standpoint, their concept of war did not comprehend, and this is a quote from Hanson, quote, the abstract notion that war is the ultimate and final arbiter of politics, a uniquely Western idea, end quote, that went back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. They therefore became, again, I'm quoting, quote, unwitting pawns in the age-old European tradition of strategic thinking that was mostly alien to their own idea of what war was for, end quote. So to put it differently, I think that what Hanson is saying is that the Mesoamerican concept of war was essentially ritualized in nature, whereas that of the Europeans was Clausewitzian, war is a continuation of politics by other means and a fight to the finish and so on. And this is a key difference according to Hanson. Now, it's very clear that the collision of Europe and Mesoamerica resulted in a demographic catastrophe that may have killed as much as 90% of the pre-contact population. Hanson uses an estimate of 25 million pre-contact Mesoamericans, down to just 1 to 2 million a century later. But Hanson does not think this was decisive in terms of the Aztec conquest either. A 70-day smallpox epidemic in Tenochtitlan in 1520 may have killed as many as 20,000 Aztecs, but this would not have weakened the Aztec empire sufficiently. And he notes that Europeans fell victim to tropical diseases to which they had no immunity. So the Mesoamericans had no immunity to smallpox, and over the long term, this was a demographic catastrophe for Mesoamericans. But during this shortened period of time, in which we're dealing with Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs, Hansen doesn't think smallpox was that big of a deal, and it was offset by diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and so forth, to whom Europeans had no natural immunity. Cultural confusion. This is something else that Hansen puts out there as a possible explanation. This argument maintains that Moctezuma and other Aztecs misunderstood Cortez and thought him an incarnation of the god Quetzalcoatl. This is something other historians have put forward. Hansen himself is dismissive of this explanation. The Aztecs were not so awed by the Spanish that they hesitated in their attempt to wipe them out in La Noche Trista. Another theory is that Cortez was able to comprehend the Mesoamerican political and cultural lay of the land, what American strategists until recently tagged the human terrain. Thanks to the ability of La Malinche to assist him through her command of Mesoamerican languages. But Cortez considers this nowhere near as important as Spanish military technology and the Western way of war the Spanish brought with them to Mesoamerica. Hansen lays greater stress on technological superiority than other historians. The Castilian sword held its lethally sharp edge in all-day battles with the Aztecs, whereas the obsidian, kind of stone embedded in the macahuitl, either broke off or grew dull in a relatively short period of time. The windlass crossbow vastly outclassed the atlatl in range and penetrating power. Then, too, the Spanish also had access to the arquebus. This was a primitive musket whose relevance to overall European warfare is important enough to merit a demonstration here. And if this seems kind of familiar to you, you've already seen one demonstration when we looked at the wars of unification in medieval Japan. One could also add, in addition to the arquebus, the presence of Spanish cannon, which, although few in number, perhaps 10 to 15 cannon is all, could be devastating in their impact. In addition to the sword, crossbow, arquebus, and cannon, Hansen also emphasizes Spanish armor, which made it very difficult for Aztec warriors to inflict fatal wounds. And above all, Western discipline. The Spanish fought in a coordinated fashion that gave them an edge on the Mesoamericans, for whom individual feats of bravery were paramount. Thus, they fought as individual warriors rather than as massed soldiers. But having said that, let's take a moment and look at this 3-minute demonstration of how an arquebus was loaded and fired. This is from a place called the Lost Colony in Roanoke, North Carolina. It's a tourist attraction today. Has a wonderful outdoor drama, kind of the colonial English equivalent of Tecumseh down in Chillicothe, Ohio, and the demonstration is really quite good.
Good morning, and welcome to the Settlement Site. My name is Philip, and I am one of the mercenaries here. What I have here to my left hand is called the arquebus, one of the very first shoulder-fired guns that we would have brought with us here in 1585. Now, in 1584, I believe that Philip Armitage and Arthur Barlow may have brought a musket. Why? Because the musket would have been about 7 to 8 inches taller than our arquebus, and the arquebus makes it a lot easier for us to traverse the tightly wooded areas. Now, the person carrying this gun around would have been called an arquebusier, and that is who I will be portraying as of right now. Now, this gun is going to bark a loud roar, and during this gun drill I'll say quite a few things about the gun, so let's go over some of the parts right now. This here is the stock. The stock is connecting the lock to the barrel. The locking mechanism here will hold the serpentine that'll connect this bit of slow burning rope to this pan in the back side of the gun, which will connect the vent hole to the breech of the gun and fire the black powder from the muzzle. Now, as I say with black powder, all of my black powder will be carried around my waist here in a device called a bandolier. Upon the bandolier, we have apostles. There's 12 apostles upon the bandolier, and each apostle is a single shot. Now, this gun is going to bark a loud roar, and it takes me about 1.5 minutes to load each shot. From here, I'll light my bit of slow burning rope. This bit of slow burning rope will be between my left hand the entire time as I'm loading and firing this gun. Now hold! With the right hand, take hold of your piece and hold it well. With the left hand, take down your piece and blow out your pan. Charge your pan. Shut your pan. Shake your pan. And to the left side, let it sink. Handle your cartridge. Charge your piece. Scouring stick drawer out. Take it shorter. And ram your powder. Scouring stick drawer out. Take it shorter. Return your scouring stick. Bring forward your piece and hold it well. With the right hand, take hold of your match. Blow well of your match. Cook up your match. Try well of your match. Cover your pan and blow well of your match. Now, present your piece. Open your pan. Give fire. Now, with the right hand, take hold of your match. Shoulder your piece. And march.
Okay. Catch all that? Do a quiz on it later.
Good morning.
Oh, okay, here we go. All right. So, superior weapons. We've been talking about superior weapons. And we've talked about what? We've talked about the sword. We've talked about the arquebus. We talked about the windlass crossbow. And we've talked about the cannon. And now let's talk about horsemen. As to heavy horsemen, the Spanish possessed only about 40 of these, but the Aztecs had no idea how to stop them. The only solution, as Europeans had learned decades earlier, was either with other heavy horsemen or with massed cavalry, disciplined, trained, and equipped with pikes or muskets to stop a mounted charge. So basically, the Mesoamericans had just no idea how to deal with heavy cavalry. Finally, Hansen points to the brigantines that Cortez used to blockade the lakes that surrounded Tenochtitlan. According to him, they turned Lake Texcoco from the Spaniards' chief vulnerability to their greatest asset. Ultimately, Hansen sees Cortez as a manifestation of the Western way of war. He makes a rather tendentious case that the Spanish reflected the political freedom of the Greeks and the allegiance to a larger polity of the Roman citizen soldier or the Frankish landed infantry. That part's a little dicey. That's where he's sort of pushing his thesis. But he's on solid ground in emphasizing Cortez's emphasis on the decisive battle, on aiming at complete conquest and control of his enemies. But he uses the Aztec case study to illustrate an element in the Western way of war not heretofore stressed in carnage and culture. The Western tradition of scientific inquiry, both in terms of its development of superior military technology, in its codified military knowledge. Cortez was familiar with the military treatises of his day, for example, and a Western tradition going back to the Greek historian Herodotus of studying other cultures as manifestations not of godlike deities, as the Aztecs mistakenly did the Spanish, but as other human societies that were simply different than their own and understandable in human terms. Thus, for Hansen, Western rationalism was the key to Spanish success. The Castilians, that is to say the Spanish, were able to size up the political organization of Tenochtitlan, the military capability of its army, and the general religion of the Mexican nation. Cortez, Hansen concludes, and I'm quoting him here, like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and other Western captains, often annihilated their numerically superior foes, not because their own soldiers were necessarily better at war, but because their traditions of free inquiry, rationalism, and science most surely were.